What are we learning about today?
Yeah, so today is an introduction to the Azure SDK for Python. And essentially, I'll be going through the basics of what the SDK is, kind of some of the patterns that you follow when you're working with the SDK, and then I'll do a short demo of a few SDKs for our various Azure services.
Awesome. Make sure y'all add your questions in the chat, and we'll ask Rohit all the questions at the end. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Happy Python Day. And I see the comment from KJ. Hello. I'll get started. So yeah, the title of the talk today is Fast, Simple, and Idiomatic. So it's an introduction to the Azure SDK for Python. And let's just jump into it. So some of the assets, looks like they didn't load, unfortunately, but it's fine. The agenda for today is an introduction. Then we'll go into the benefits for the Azure SDK for Python, so why you want to use it. Some basic steps to using the SDK, which is pretty consistent across all of our various libraries. A quick demo, and then we can close with Q&A. So starting off with an introduction. So the Azure SDK for Python, what is it? The Azure SDK, in short, this kind of sentence, is a collection of Python libraries designed to provide an interface for developers to interact with Azure services. So in short, if I'm writing Python code and I want to interact with one of the many services that exist within Azure, I'll use the SDK to finish my task there. Just a quick shout out to our GitHub repo. We are open source. We have over 3.8K stars, approaching 4,000. Over 2,000 projects use it currently in GitHub, and we have over 180 libraries for a bunch of services across Azure. So just a quick demo of kind of the terms that we use. So we have two different types of libraries within our Azure SDK. The first one is a management library, or management plane library. So these are used to create, configure, and otherwise manage resources. So if you want to spin up a storage account or something like that, you'll use a management library. And if you're installing our packages, they're generally prefixed with MGMT in the package name to denote that this is a management library, versus the client libraries, which is our next one, or a data plane library. They're called we kind of use those terms interchanged. And essentially, those are used to interact with already provisioned Azure services. So if I've already spun up a storage account, then I'll be using the data plane libraries to be able to talk to that service and maybe upload a file and so on. So now that we know what the SDK is, we'll jump into the benefits of using the Azure SDK for Python. And the title of the talk was Fast, Simple, and Idiomatic. So we'll jump into those. So we're starting off with fast. So in general, the SDK will greatly reduce the amount of time to write Azure-specific code. It will reduce time needed to onboard the capabilities of a service due to the fact that there's a library that kind of describes what you can do. It'll reduce the need to write and maintain best practices for cloud-facing code. So if you had your own code that called the REST APIs, as opposed to using our SDK, it'd be a lot more complicated, and you would have to maintain that yourself, as opposed to using the SDKs, which do that for you. In addition, the operations within the SDK are optimized for performance, so you don't have to worry about all of that. And also, we have a very robust exception system that provides more details and helps debug code quicker. Moving on to simple. So we have built-in OpenTelemetry support for tracing applications. You don't need to do any additional work to get that. That comes out of the box. We have a consistent design for cross-service and cross-language, regardless of the REST API underneath. Azure is a huge cloud offering. There's so many different services, and all these services do things a little bit differently. The Azure SDK team does their best to kind of unite this under one familiar and consistent system for people to use in their libraries. So you don't have to worry about all of the complexities that comes with that. We give you a convenient library to be able to complete all of your tasks and focus on the code that you really want to. Additionally, the libraries will keep up to date with new service functionality. So if a service adds a new feature, then the SDK team's job is to add that feature into the library so users can use it in a convenient way. We also have consistent retries, exceptions, and HTTP client management all through Azure Core. And this is one of the biggest value propositions of the SDK, where everything is consistent, again, because there are so many different services in Azure, it can get really confusing. So having one library that kind of unites all of these things is very great for developers to focus on business-facing code as opposed to figuring out things with Azure. Additionally, we have authentication libraries with Azure Identity, and this makes it so that you can focus less on all the hassle there, and more on, again, the business-facing code. So The last point that I had was Idiomatic. So we are very Python focused. We were built by Python developers for Python developers. We have data models in this library as opposed to other cloud libraries you might have used, which allows for IntelliSense in your IDE, makes the development process a lot easier, and I'll show that in our demo here. We also have an active effort to reach full typing annotations across our SDK, so we have type hints for all of the data types that we have. Makes it easier, again, for you to understand what you're working with and where. We also have async operation support in the SDK. We try to follow the best trends for Python idiomatic libraries. And lastly, the reference documentation within Microsoft Learn is getting a Pythonic makeover. So it's going to look a lot more friendly and used to what Python developers will expect in the coming months, which I'm really excited about. That's one of the projects that I'm leading. The moving next is some fun facts. The Azure CLI uses Python SDK libraries underneath. So if you've ever used an Azure CLI, you've technically used the Python SDK as well. We actually wrote our own AMQP messaging protocol for Python in our messaging libraries. This is in-house, and it's one of our proudest achievements on the team. Additionally, we support PyScript and Pyodide, which is Python in the browser, in beta. And our RefDoc revamp that I talked about earlier is actually one of the largest Python documentation projects currently out right now. It is massive, as you can imagine, with all the libraries across Azure. We're figuring out how to organize and structure our documentation in a more idiomatic way for Python developers. And lastly, members of the Azure SDK team have attended PyCon US since 2014. I was there this past year. And yeah, we've been around for 8+ years. So we're definitely very in tune with the community and would like to continue to be so. Okay, so now that we understand kind of why and what the SDK is, let's jump into some basic steps for using the SDK. So for using a management plane library, you want to ensure you have the permissions in Azure to create and manage resources. You authenticate with our Azure Identity Library, create your client object, and then do something. And this will look really similar for data plane. So first, you want to ensure you have the permission to operate instead of create or manage. You want to operate on an already created Azure resource. You authenticate with Azure Identity, create your client objects, and then do something. So here's what that would look like. So first, you want to ensure you have access via RBAC. RBAC is role-based access control. So it essentially allows organizations to manage different capabilities you have on different things and resources within the cloud. So you could add a role assignment here, or if you're more comfortable with the CLI, you can also create for RBAC here. So you want to ensure that you have the permission to do what you want to do with the resources in Azure. Next, you will authenticate with Azure Identity. This class that I'm showing here is the default Azure credential. It's a kind of the crown jewel of the Azure Identity Library, where essentially it will try various different credentials. As you can see, it starts with, might be a little bit hard to see, but environment credential, then workload identity credential, Azure Managed Identity credential, and then so on. So it even goes into the Azure CLI, PowerShell developer CLI, which you just saw before, and it tests all of those credentials until one works. You can also use a specific class of credential if you'd like, and that's what I'll do in the demo. But in general, you want to authenticate with the Azure Identity Library as like so. Next, depending on what service you're working with, you'll want to create a client for it. And some services have several clients. For example, here is Blob Storage, and there are 3 different clients that you can use to interact with it. And generally, that will show you the different scopes of operation that you can have. So for here, with Blob Service, with the Blob Storage service, we have the Blob Service client, which will allow you to manage the resources and containers. You'll have a container client, which allows you to manipulate a container and the blobs inside of them. And then lastly, a blob client, which will allow you to manipulate a blob. And a blob is just a file that gets uploaded into Azure Storage. So now that you have the permissions, you have your identity verified, and you have the client to do something with, the next step naturally is to do something. So for example, we have this example code here from one of our quick starts. You can see in this squared off section, we have our container, or we have our container client. So then we can do something like list blobs. And now we have a Python iterable object that we can go through. And now it's just easy to interact with the library. This goes from very complex REST API call with all of the correct headers and auth to a one-line Python line that one line of Python code that just allows you to focus again more on the code that you should be writing as opposed to boilerplate and making sure you manage all of that. So I think we can jump into a demo. I may need some help putting this up. But yeah, I have 3 different files within VS Code here. And essentially, they'll go through, there'll be data plane SDKs working with different services. So first, I have the storage blobs. Next, I have Cosmos. And next, I have event hubs. And I'll explain what these services do as we go. But essentially, we started with storage. So storage is just where we upload our files to the cloud. And I just wrote a few lines of Python code to kind of describe how to interact with the service. So we start by importing the OS library. This is for accessing our environment variables, as you can see on line 7. We have our storage account URL in environment variables. We'll use that for creating our client later on. We import the Azure Identity library, and we use the Azure CLI credential. So in here, in our terminal, I can type in AZ login, and then this will open up a new window in my browser. I sign in with Active Directory, Entra, and then I'm good to go, and that's my credential. And then from the Azure Storage Blob library, we'll import the Blob Service Client. And technically, I've imported the Blob Client and Container Client, but we get those implicitly. We can also add type hinting, which I'll do in a second. So we have our credential here with the Azure CLI credential that'll run, and I've already logged in, so nothing to worry about there. And again, we have our storage account URL. That gives us enough of what we need to create the Blob Service Client. So that's the first one. And the Blob Service Client configures the account properties. You can create, list, and delete containers and retrieve specific clients as well. So we've created our Blob Service Client here in line 11. And then we can go one level deeper and go into our specific container. And I want to create a container called Azure Python Day. So I've created that as my container name. And then I can use the service client, Blob Service Client that we've created, run the create container method. And again, part of the benefit of our SDK, we have very great IntelliSense support. If I want to learn more, I can scroll down. We have all of our doc strings here. And then we pass in the name, which is our container name. And again, we have type hinting. So we can have something like this. So now we know exactly what the type is of the value that's getting retrieved. And also, VS Code isn't complaining that I'm not using it anymore. So super cool. And now that we have our container and we've created that container, then we'll want to upload a file. So I have a file here. I have, let's see, Azure Python Day.txt. It's a haiku. Azure sky is so blue. Python scales its vast expanse. Cloud and code entwined. And I asked ChatGPT to write this because Python is easier to write than poems. So that's my file that I want to upload to the Azure storage. So then what we'll do is we'll create a blob client, and we'll use the service client to get a blob client. We'll pass in the container name, and then we'll pass in the file name that we have here. Then we'll be printing, uploading to Azure storage as blob, and then we'll be uploading it with this section here. And then we'll also just download that just to see the multiple operations we can run with the container client and the blob client. So without any further ado, let's do Python storage blob.py. Run some simple Python code. Our terminal should print in just a second. There we go. So you can see it says uploading to Azure storage as blob down here. You uploaded this file, and then we've downloaded it here. So we have a downloaded version right here. So not pretty, but just a short little explanation of how you can use the SDK to speed up your operations. In terms of the actual logic with connecting to Azure storage here, there's really not that much. We have our credentials, and honestly, I've split things out in multiple lines to make it a little bit more readable. If there was a little bit more business logic, you can see how the Azure SDK becomes a tiny part of what could be very complicated, and then you can focus on the code that you want to be working on. So if I wanted to, edit this haiku, if I wasn't a fan of ChatGPT's work, I can do that. I can re-upload it. I can upload it with a different name, and so on. So this is great for file management and so on. So that was our first demo, and like I said, the process was very similar. So I got all of my permissions from all of my permissions from the portal. I then used the Azure CLI credential to verify my identity to make sure that I'm the person I am that has those permissions. And then I just used the SDK to create the client and do something. We'll run into a Cosmos example next. And Cosmos is a database offering that we have in Azure. And it's very similar to the last time. We have our environment variables. We have the endpoint, and we have the primary key for Cosmos. And this time, I won't be using the Azure Identity Library. I'll be just using a primary key to show that you can use multiple types of authentication. We have a database name called to-do list, and we have a container name named items. So then we have our client that we create, the Cosmos client, and that is the overall client for the service. So we pass that in. Again, we can have our type annotation here if we would like. This one is pretty obvious, but if we wanted to do on a method here to make it a little bit more clear what type we're returning, we can do that. Again, we have typing in our library, which is very convenient for more complex code bases. So we pass in the variables of our endpoint for our URL, our credential, our key, and then we have the consistency level for a session. And then we get our database client, and then we get our container client. So we have a database inside of this Cosmos resource, and then we get the container, which is where all of our values are that we can query on later. And if I run this code, see, Python cosmos.py, it'll get all of the items in this container. So we can see all of the values here. And yeah, so that's that. So if I want to be a little bit more specific, then I can also do item and then text. And let's see what that says. Great, it says hello from the very first Azure Python day. So that makes it really easy. And there's a little bit of a spoiler below if you read the comments. You can see that we have, we can also query this database. So if I want to comment this out, then just like any other NoSQL database, I can use, or not only SQL database, I can use SQL here to select and run a query, and then pass in the value where I want to see that I want to just retrieve something that says Azure Python Day. So if I run that, that's what it should be. I didn't print it out in a pretty way, but that is the iterator object that will have the item that we saw earlier. Moving on, we have our third and final demo. And again, following a very, very similar procedure to the other ones, it's Event Hubs. And Event Hubs is a streaming platform and ingestion service. So you can send a lot of messages, receive a lot of messages, and store them. So yeah, let's just jump into it. So again, from our Event Hub library, we'll import the event data class for what we'll be sending up to Event Hubs. From the async libraries, we'll be importing the producer client and the consumer client. Again, a great part of our library is you can just hover over something and you know exactly what it does. It has a perfect doc string here. So the producer client defines a high-level client for sending events. And then if we do our consumer client, it'll be the same for receiving events. So now that we know what that does, we go back with our credential here, and we have our same variables that we need to start up the client with our name and our namespace variable. So I have two methods here. I have one called send messages, one called, I guess three, one called on event, and then one called receive messages. So in the send messages, I'll be using the producer client to send messages, as we saw earlier. So I'll create that client object with the namespace, the event hub name, and then the token credential that I got from the Azure CLI credential up here. And then in an async with, I will then send a few messages. So I'll create a batch of events, and then I will add all of these events. So it'll say, hello, the first message, then from Azure Python Day, and then I'll send that. And that's what my first method will do. So let's actually run that really quick. Python. Great. So I've sent the messages. I didn't have a confirmation that I, or print or anything that confirms that I finished it. But if I comment, if I uncomment this line and comment the send messages, then we'll run a receiver, and that will receive the messages. And generally, we have an on-event handler, which will essentially tell us what to do whenever we get a message from Event Hubs. So it'll just print out the events body as string using that method. And then we'll use the partition context ID as kind of the specific partition where these events are stored. And by default, this is 0 because we don't have any special partitions with this code sample. So to receive messages, again, very similar process. We have all of our RBAC first. We have all of our identity set. We create the client using the credential that we have, and then we can now do stuff with it. So we've created our credential in a very similar way. We use the consumer group default here because that's what Event Hub's default is. That's just an extra variable we pass in, and then everything else is the same. So again, async with, and then we receive all of our messages, and we use the starting position -1 to have the beginning of the partition. And again, the partition is just 0 because we don't have any special one. So if we run that now, where we run our receive messages function on line 60, we should be able to receive our messages. 1 second. There we go. So you can see here that our messages have been received. We received all of our events in order. Hello from Azure Python Day. Perfect. And essentially, that is it. That is a demo of all, the Azure SDK's libraries across 3 different services. As you can tell, it follows the same kind of procedure that I outlined, where we want to get permission, we want to confirm our identity, want to create a client, and then we want to do something. So these libraries exist all across all of our services. These libraries that I showed specifically are data plane services, meaning that we can interact with services. But if you just want to spin up something and maybe automate the creation and management of your Azure resources, you can use our management plane libraries for that as well. And again, very similar procedure where you get your permission, you get your identity confirmed, you get your client, and then you can do whatever you need to do, either manage or interact with services, depending on management plane or data plane libraries. If we go back to the slides, I have one last thing, I believe. One moment. Cool. Yeah, my one last thing is a Q&A. So if there's any questions, open to that. And if not, thank you. And you can learn more about the Python SDK here. I have a QR code here for any Python SDK users. If you scan this, this will take you to a SurveyMonkey survey that you can use to kind of give us some more feedback. Being an SDK, it's very hard to be a product manager because it's hard to get feedback without explicitly asking for it. So this is me explicitly asking for it. And this is the link to our Python releases, the first one. The second one is our GitHub, where you can create issues and chat with us. And then also we have a Twitter at Azure SDK. If you have anything you want to say, tag us there, we'll respond. And then lastly, if you have any questions, you can go on Stack Overflow and use the tags Azure and Python, and a member from our team will take a look. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. I'm just going to give people a moment to go to that QR code. I definitely brought my device out. I'm going to my QR code so we can give you some feedback on that. That's really, really great. Thank you so much for that presentation. You had me at Pythonic Makeover. That's exciting.
Yes.
Do you want to say a little bit about what you're doing with that? And
yeah, sure. So the Azure SDK team, specifically me working on Python, has been coordinating with our Microsoft Learn team to completely revamp how our docs for Python libraries are viewed on Microsoft Learn, formerly Microsoft Docs. And yeah, I'm super excited by that project because essentially it means that Python developers can view documentation and navigate in a way that feels really natural to them. We did a bunch of user research, a bunch of studies on how Python developers like to organize their libraries. So this will be applying to all of our Python SDKs on Azure, but also for libraries that aren't necessarily on Azure, like our upcoming semantic kernel, which is kind of Microsoft's version of LangChain, and so on. So it's really exciting to be able to kind of update the way that Python developers at Microsoft work. So super excited for that.
I've been seeing you talk about it a little bit on the channels and stuff like that. I'm very, very excited to see the work that you're going to bring to us. Awesome, awesome, awesome. And we also had some poetry in there too, so we got a little bit artistic. Are you familiar with the Zen of Python?
I'm not, no.
It's just a poem about doing Python. It's kind of ingrained to some of the Python culture a little bit, but we'll talk about that another time. I honestly like the Chat GPT poem.
It was pretty great, yeah.
And we got to hang out at PyCon last year, and you did a plug for some of the stuff you were talking about at PyCon. So that's great. I hope everybody gets to that list. Oh yeah, and Jay mentioned in the chat, import this, and you can get the Zen of Python from your terminal, any terminal.
Well, pip install first, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, good. And your demo was great. So very thorough. I appreciate that.
Cool.
Let's check to see if we have any questions that we can answer today. Let's see.
I see a question about Cosmos. For that particular question, I will get back to you. I will chat with the Cosmos service PM there.
Great. And that was just about the support for Cosmos. And we'll get back. Okay, great. And how about this one? I don't know if this fits in the parameters of what we're talking about today. But once you have service principals and our testing utilization of those identities, it's not a problem. But during development, there's an annoyance with roles expiring every day. We do have some conversations back and forth getting to this particular issue. But do you have any thoughts on that, Rohit?
Yeah, we have the Azure CLI command to be able to add your role. I think the specific role permissions depends on the organization that you're in, but I believe those should stick. I haven't personally seen an issue with that, but again, I don't work in a company that uses it with their own policies and whatnot. But if I believe there is a way to automate that permission, that RBAC permission with the Azure CLI, and then also I think as a result, the management plane libraries that we have.
Awesome response. And this is such a specific issue. I'm so glad that we have our experts in the chat. Pamela's been doing a great work. Jay, we've been shouting you out a whole bunch. Thank you so much for like doing some of that legwork and reaching out to our individuals, our community, the whole reason why we do this. So next Python day that I'm really excited for, we're going to do some more of this as well. And you got a round of applause as well. Thank you so much for all the work you're all doing on the Python ecosystem. You in particular, like I want to give you a round of applause. Great. I think that's it for our questions. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great Python day.